I can still smell the bourbon in the air when it happened, that sharp mix of alcohol and old wood from my father's study in Fayetteville, the kind of smell that clings to everything even after the fire dies out. I had been home less than an hour when Patricia called the meeting. My father's will was to be read that afternoon. I was still wearing my uniform jacket, the one I kept even after my discharge. It wasn't vanity, it was habit. 12 years in the Army makes every stitch of fabric feel like a piece of skin you can't remove. The Hale estate had changed since I was last there. The portraits were gone, replaced by photos of Patricia in black dresses and charity galas. She sat near the fireplace, one heel hooked on the rung of her chair, holding a glass of bourbon like it was a weapon. When she saw me, her lips curved not quite a smile. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading my father's voice through legal paragraphs. Something about trust funds property in Savannah and the final clause that froze everything pending verification of beneficiaries. Patricia's hand tightened on the glass. The ice cracked. "That money's mine," she snapped, her southern drawl cutting through the quiet. "He promised me everything." I looked at her, calm on the surface, but shaking inside. It was Dad's legacy. I said, "Not a prize." Her eyes went wild. She rose so fast the chair toppled. The lawyer flinched. She came toward me, the glass still in her hand. For a second, I thought she might throw it, but instead, she struck my face with her palm. The sound filled the room like a gunshot. My cheek burned, but I didn't move. Not in front of her. Not in front of the strangers who were now staring frozen, some with phones already raised, filming without understanding why. Patricia turned to the shelf, grabbed the framed case that held my dog tags. They were scratched and tarnished, the same ones I'd worn through sandstorms and nights under mortar fire. My last link to the soldier I had been. She held them up with a sneer. "Here's your service, Captain," she said. "Ashes and lies." Then she opened the fireplace grate and threw them in. The metal hissed. The smell of burning steel filled the room. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "She's burning her stepdaughter's Army tags." I stood there watching the flames lick through my name. The lawyer tried to stop her muttering about witnesses, about evidence, but Patricia laughed, her voice slurred and bright. "No one's going to believe a washed-up soldier with no proof she ever served." My hand shook. I wanted to reach into the fire to grab what was left, but something in me locked. Years of training, control, discipline. I swallowed everything, every word, every tear, because I knew if I said one more thing, she would win. The phones kept recording. The heat pressed against my face. In that moment, I wasn't Captain Hale. I wasn't even a daughter. I was an intruder in my own bloodline. I took one step back, then another. No one stopped me. Outside, the North Carolina sun was low and gold-sharp against the haze. I could still hear Patricia's laughter behind the closed door. It echoed down the hall like something poisonous. I touched my cheek. The skin throbbed. I looked at my hand and saw a faint smear of ash. That was all that was left of 12 years of service. 12 years of pride, discipline, and the quiet oath I'd lived by. I walked down the gravel driveway past the gates where my father once waited to pick me up from school. There were people standing outside, now neighbors, mostly curious faces, illuminated by the screens of their phones. One of them whispered my name. I didn't stop. I reached my truck and sat inside, staring at the estate through the windshield. Smoke rose in thin threads from the chimney. It looked almost peaceful, like the house was exhaling. My phone buzzed. A notification. A video already spreading through local feeds. The caption read, "Stepmother burns veterans' dog tags during will reading." I laughed once, a sound too dry to be human. Then I whispered to myself, "She burned the only proof I ever served my country." I drove away before the sun disappeared completely, the headlights carving two clean lines through the dusk. My reflection in the glass looked nothing like the woman who had once saluted flag and command. Somewhere deep down beneath the humiliation and the shame, something colder began to form. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment the war began again. Only this time it wasn't overseas. It was at home. And I was done losing. Before I tell you what the DNA results from the VA revealed, tell me, have you ever been betrayed by someone who called you family? The rain started that night long after I had left the Hale estate behind. I sat in my truck outside my apartment in Fayetteville and watched the drops blur the streetlights into gold streaks. The sound of water hitting the windshield was the same rhythm I had heard years ago on the metal roofs of tents in Iraq. It used to calm me. That night, it only reminded me that even storms could sound like memory. When I finally went inside, the quiet was too loud. My apartment was small, practical, nothing decorative except a single photograph of my father in uniform beside me at my commissioning ceremony. I touched the frame and whispered, "You wouldn't have let her do that." Then I laughed at myself because maybe he would have. Patricia Hale had always hated what she could not control, and I had never been one of her obedient projects. The first time she entered our house in Augusta, Georgia, I was 7, wearing my father's oversized flight jacket and pretending to march around the living room. She looked at me as if I were tracking mud across marble. "Girls don't play soldier, sweetheart," she said, setting her gloves on the table. "They learn piano." I remember how my father smiled awkwardly and changed the subject. My mother, Claire, had been gone for less than a year then. A car accident, they said. People brought casseroles and kind words, but I only remember the silence afterward, the kind that settles over a home when someone erases laughter from it. When Patricia arrived, she filled that silence with rules. No running inside, no talking back, no touching father's medals. I tried to please her for a while, but children sense contempt faster than love. By the time I was 10, I had learned to keep my voice low and my eyes busy. Patricia filled our home with soft music and stricter routines. She told the neighbors we were a refined household now. She introduced herself as Mrs. Colonel Hale, even though my father never used the title socially. She made him trade his pickup for a black sedan because it looked more respectable. Sometimes late at night I would hear them arguing. Words like image and status cut through the walls. My father's patience stretched thinner every year. When I told him I wanted to apply to West Point, he looked proud for a moment before he saw Patricia standing behind me in the doorway, arms crossed. Her face turned to glass. "You want to crawl in the dirt with boys?" she asked. "After everything your father's done for you?" "I want to serve," I said. She laughed softly, a sound I would later hear in my nightmares. "Serve? Who, Rowan?" "No one will remember a woman with a rifle." My father tried to step in, but she silenced him with one look. "Let her go," she said coldly. "Let her see what happens when you chase delusions." That was the last night we spoke without bitterness. I left for West Point the following summer. Patricia didn't come to my send-off. She said she had a charity luncheon. My father hugged me at the bus station and slipped a folded note into my hand. "Honor is what you do when no one's watching." I carried that note through 4 deployments. Years later, when I returned from Afghanistan with a knee injury, Patricia greeted me at the door of the Augusta house, wearing pearls and disapproval. "You look tired," she said, her tone almost sympathetic. "Maybe it's time you stop pretending this uniform is your calling. There are other ways to make your father proud." But he was proud. I saw it in the way he stood taller when he introduced me to his friends. Patricia noticed too. Every compliment to me was an insult to her control. She began managing his appointments, screening his calls, whispering that I was wasting my life. When he fell ill, she became his entire world, and she made sure I was locked out of it. The day he died, I wasn't even in the same state. Patricia called me 6 hours after the doctors pronounced him gone. "He didn't want a scene," she said flatly. "The funeral's tomorrow. Keep it modest." I drove all night from Fayetteville to Augusta, but by the time I arrived, the service was over. She had buried him without me. Only a folded flag sat on the porch with my name written on an envelope. Inside, a single line, "He knew you'd understand." Standing there in the rain, I had understood nothing except that Patricia Hale had won something that day. Something she believed was hers by right, the final word. Now, years later, in that quiet Fayetteville apartment, I realized her hatred was never about me choosing the army. It was about me refusing to be hers. I looked again at the photo of my father. Behind his smile was the same fatigue I had seen near the end. Maybe he had fought too many battles on the field and at home. I whispered into the empty room. "She burned your daughter's name." "Dad, I won't let her keep the ashes." Outside, the rain softened. The world smelled clean again, but inside me something still smoldered. I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and wrote a single line in my notebook. "Tomorrow I reclaim what's mine." That sentence wasn't anger. It was strategy. Years in uniform had taught me that victory never comes from rage. It comes from precision, and Patricia Hale had just given me a new mission. The next morning came too early. Fayetteville light always carried a kind of blunt honesty cutting through blinds like truth you can't avoid. I brewed coffee, the bitter kind soldiers drink out of habit, not taste. My cheek still held the faint mark from Patricia's slap, but the sting had settled into something quieter, a pulse beneath the skin that reminded me I was still here. I opened my laptop and saw the clip again, already shared across social feeds. The caption read, "Veteran humiliated by stepmother during will reading." The comments scrolled endlessly, some angry, some cruel, most just watching. In another life, I might have begged for them to take it down. In this one, I let them watch. Let the world see how far dignity could bend before it broke. That video became the mirror I needed. For years, I had told myself I was free of her control. I wore the uniform, saluted the flag, and convinced myself I'd escaped the house she ruled. But there she was still dictating what people thought of me even after I'd left her walls. Control doesn't need proximity. It needs memory. Patricia had built her kingdom inside my head. I had carried it across continents. The truth of that realization hit harder than her slap. It was one thing to survive a tyrant. It was another to realize you'd kept her voice alive long after she stopped speaking. I turned off the laptop, poured another cup of coffee, and opened the drawer where I kept the old Army file, the one marked personal. Inside were fragments of my service life commendations, a discharge letter, a photo from Kabul, and the duplicate dog tag I'd ordered years ago after one had gone missing. I ran my thumb over the engraved letters, Rowan L. Hale, Captain O. positive, and something inside me hardened. I decided to visit the local VA office that day. I needed to replace the burned tags officially. It wasn't about sentiment. It was about identity. The tags had been the one thing Patricia couldn't touch proof of who I was when the world doubted it. Now, even that proof had turned to smoke. The Fayetteville VA sat near the base entrance, a brick building with faded flags and a lobby that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. The receptionist looked up as I approached. "Replacement request," she asked, already pulling a form. I nodded. "Yes, ma'am. My originals were destroyed." She handed me a clipboard and said, "We'll need verification through your service record and DNA confirmation. Standard procedure now." Duh. The word landed strange. I had given samples before, blood tests, ID verification, all part of protocol. But something about her phrasing made me pause. "DNA confirmation," I repeated. She smiled politely. "It's just policy. We cross-match it with your file on record from enlistment. You'll get the new tags in a few weeks." I signed the form and gave the sample a simple cheek swab. The entire process took 10 minutes. When it was over, I stepped outside into the wind and felt the faintest shift, like the click of a lock turning somewhere far away. Driving home, I thought about how Patricia had always needed witnesses. She never hurt without an audience. Even when she ignored me, she made sure others noticed. That was her real talent, humiliation as performance. But now, after years of silence, she had overplayed her role. Burning those tags in front of cameras wasn't victory. It was evidence. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled. Not from joy, but from clarity. The same cameras that had captured my disgrace would soon capture her downfall. I didn't know how yet, but the instinct was there. The same instinct that had kept me alive on patrols when everything went wrong. You don't win by shouting back. You win by letting the enemy show their hand. That night, I sat by the window again, notebook open. The rain had stopped, but thunder rolled in the distance. I wrote the words, "Control ends when exposure begins." It wasn't poetry. It was strategy. I had spent 12 years analyzing intelligence reports, tracking patterns, uncovering lies buried beneath paperwork. This would be no different. I folded the VA receipt carefully and placed it beside the photo of my father. His face in that frame seemed calmer now, like he was waiting for me to understand something he couldn't say when he was alive. Maybe he had known what Patricia had done, how far she would go to preserve her image. Maybe he had tried to warn me in his quiet way. I whispered to the photo, "You built me for battle, Dad. Just not this one." Outside, Fayetteville's night hummed with bass traffic and faint echoes of jets overhead. The air smelled of wet asphalt and resolve. I didn't realize it then, but the decision I made that night to request new tags to reclaim proof would open the first crack in Patricia's empire of control. The next time the VA called, it wouldn't be about replacement tags. It would be about something much deeper. And when they did, everything I thought I knew about myself would begin to unravel. The message from the VA arrived just after midnight. I had been sitting on the couch half asleep with the television flickering soundlessly in the dark. The subject line read, "Follow-up verification required." At first, I thought it was routine, a clerical check, maybe a signature missing. But when I opened it, the first line froze me. "Solid DNA sample on file does not match primary service record." The words didn't make sense. My heart stuttered once, then beat faster. I read it again slowly this time. They were asking for secondary verification because data inconsistency was found between archived and current genetic profiles. I stared at that phrase until the screen blurred. For a second, I thought maybe Patricia had somehow tampered with the record, bribed someone to erase me. That was the kind of power she liked to wield, quiet, invisible, permanent. But this was the federal VA system. Even she couldn't reach that far. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the message, waiting for a reply I didn't know how to write. The apartment felt smaller, the air heavier. Outside, the hum of traffic had faded, leaving only the faint whistle of wind against the windows. I could hear my heartbeat in that silence. 12 years in the Army had taught me to read reports to find the flaw in the data. But there was no flaw here. There was only me, and now even that was under question. I got up and walked to the small mirror by the kitchen. My reflection looked the same. Brown hair, tied back, sharp eyes, faint scar along my jaw from a Humvee door years ago. The face I'd seen every morning before deployment. The face I'd saluted in the mirror the day I earned my captain's bars. But in that moment, it looked like a stranger's. I remembered something my father once said after one of Patricia's tirades. Sometimes truth hides in plain sight. Rowan, you just have to look at what people avoid. Maybe that was what this was. Something avoided, something buried. I sat back down and read the email again, trying to convince myself it was a system glitch, but deep down I knew glitches don't come with phrasing that careful. The VA never words things carelessly. The night stretched longer. My phone buzzed once, then again. News alerts. The video had spread beyond Fayetteville, now trending in veteran forums and local channels. People were arguing, some defending me, others calling it staged. I closed the phone and pressed my palms against my eyes until sparks danced behind them. For years, I had faced mortar rounds, convoy ambushes, medevac nights when the air smelled of iron and dust. I had known fear in ways most people couldn't imagine. But this uncertainty about who I was cut deeper. It was the kind of fear that doesn't scream. It whispers. I made tea just to keep my hands busy. The kettle whistled sharply, startling me more than gunfire ever had. I sat at the table and opened my notebook. The page from the night before stared back. Control ends when exposure begins. I added a new line beneath it. Even control of identity can be stolen. I wrote until dawn. Half the words made no sense, but the motion helped. Outside, the first hint of morning tinted the sky pale gray. Somewhere, flags were rising over Fort Liberty, catching the wind. I thought of the oath I'd taken there, the one I believed tied me to something unbreakable. Now I wasn't sure what that oath was worth if the name behind it didn't belong to me. I closed the notebook and whispered into the quiet. If they erased me, I'll find out who they wrote in my place. By morning, I had drafted and deleted 5 versions of an email to the VA. The words wouldn't come out right. Every sentence sounded either too formal or too desperate. Finally, I called the number listed in the message. A woman's voice answered after 2 rings, steady and low. Department of Veterans Affairs Forensic Verification Division. This is Dr. Maya Ortega. Her calmness steadied me. Dr. Ortega, this is Captain Rowan Hale, retired. I received a message about an inconsistency in my DNA file. There was a pause on the line, long enough for me to hear the shuffle of papers. Yes, Captain Hale, she said at last, voice neutral but deliberate. I have your record in front of me. Thank you for calling so quickly. I could hear her typing. The system flagged your file because the DNA sample we just received doesn't match the genetic profile archived under your service ID. It's not a small discrepancy, it's a full mismatch. I gripped the edge of the desk. So, what does that mean? It could be a clerical error, she said carefully, or a misfiled record. But we double-checked the identifiers. The archived profile was created in 1987, the same year you were born. My throat tightened. Then whose DNA is on file under my name? That's what we're trying to determine, she said. This isn't common, Captain. We're initiating a secondary verification. It will take about a week. I'll call you directly with the results. Her professionalism didn't hide the curiosity beneath her tone. May I ask? She continued. Has your record ever been amended or replaced? Adoption, name change, anything of that nature? No, I said automatically. Never. She hesitated. Understood. We'll be in touch. When I hung up, my hand was shaking. The sound of her voice, steady official distant, had made the situation feel real in a way the email hadn't. I sat there staring at the phone like it might start speaking again. Outside Fayetteville moved on as if nothing had happened. A mail truck passed, kids shouted near the bus stop, someone's dog barked. Ordinary sounds that suddenly felt foreign, as though I had slipped into a version of life that didn't belong to me. I tried to distract myself by cleaning. Dishes, laundry, wiping down counters already spotless. Anything to keep from replaying the words full mismatch. But my mind wouldn't let go. Patricia's face flashed through my thoughts, the smug certainty the way she had thrown those dog tags into the fire without hesitation. For years, she had treated me like an outsider in my own house. Maybe she hadn't been wrong. That idea landed hard. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at my hands. They were calloused from work, from years of gripping weapons and tools and steering wheels across deserts. Hands that had built, repaired, fought, but if what the VA said was true, they might belong to someone else's story. The phone rang again just after noon. Unknown number. I answered quickly. Captain Hale, Dr. Ortega's voice said brisk, but not unkind. I wanted to inform you that we forwarded your file for independent analysis. Off the record, I'll tell you this doesn't look like a system error. The archived DNA appears to belong to another individual entirely, and there are sealed amendments in your personnel file I don't have clearance to view. Her tone softened. If I were you, I'd prepare for questions you didn't expect to ask. She paused, then added, and Captain, take care of yourself. These things have a way of reopening old wounds. The line clicked dead. I sat frozen, the phone still in my hand. For years, Patricia's cruelty had defined my life. Now it seemed she might not just have destroyed my proof of service, she might have built my entire life on a lie. The room felt colder, smaller. My father's photograph on the shelf caught a stripe of sunlight, and for a moment it looked like he was turning away. The drive to Savannah took 5 hours, but it felt longer, as if the highway itself were stretching to test my resolve. The sky was heavy with late summer heat, that southern kind of warmth that clings to your neck and makes memory feel close enough to touch. I had printed the old property records that Dr. Ortega sent me, a courtesy she said shouldn't exist yet, somehow did. They listed my father's address in Augusta during the year of my birth. 2 streets away from that address was another name I hadn't heard since childhood, Evelyn Stroud. She had been our neighbor once. I barely remembered her, a tall woman with soft gray hair who used to hand me peppermint candies through the fence. My father said she had known my mother, but he never spoke of it again. After my father's death, Patricia sold that house and everything in it, closing the chapter before I could reread it. Savannah's air smelled of river salt and old magnolia. The streets shimmered in the heat. Evelyn's house was small, but neatly kept a porch wrapped in ivy, an American flag faded from years of sun. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, trying to calm the pulse in my throat. I had faced interrogation rooms quieter than this. Finally, I walked to the door and knocked. The door opened after a few seconds. Evelyn looked older than I remembered, but sharp, her eyes clear blue, the kind that miss nothing. Rowan, she said, as though testing the name. Yes, ma'am, I wondered when you'd come. Her words stopped me cold. You knew I would. She nodded and stepped aside. Come in. I made tea. The house smelled like lemon polish and thyme. Photographs lined the walls, weddings, graduations, a few black and white pictures of young soldiers standing beside planes. She motioned for me to sit at a small table near the window. The tea was already waiting 2 cups, as if she'd set the place for me days ago. Evelyn folded her hands, studying me with a gentleness that still carried weight. "You look just like her," she said quietly. I frowned. "Like who, Elise Carson?" The name landed like a thunderclap in my chest. "Who is that?" She didn't answer right away. She took a sip of tea, eyes glancing toward the window as though checking for ghosts. "She lived 2 streets over from your father's old house. A nurse, kind, stubborn, always humming when she worked in her garden. She disappeared the same summer your father married Patricia." I stared at her. "Disappeared how officially?" Evelyn said, voice steady. "She moved out of state. That's what the papers said. But people talk." I remember police at her house one night, quiet but serious. And then she was gone. No family around, no forwarding address. Just vanished. My pulse thudded in my ears. "Why are you telling me this?" Evelyn reached for a drawer in the sideboard and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "Because I kept something. I wasn't sure when or if I should give it to you." She slid the envelope across the table. Inside was a photograph. A woman stood in a garden sunlight catching her hair. She looked young, no older than 30, holding a baby wrapped in a white blanket. Around the baby's wrist gleamed a small silver bracelet shaped like a train engine. I didn't breathe for several seconds. I looked down at my own wrist. The same bracelet, dulled with age, still circled it. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's eyes softened. "She gave it to your father before she disappeared. Said it was for safekeeping. Said she trusted him." She paused. "I think she trusted the wrong person." I sat back dizzy. The room seemed to tilt slightly. I tried to imagine my father, honorable, disciplined, keeping secrets like that. Patricia's words echoed faintly in my mind. "He promised me everything." "Did you ever talk to her again?" I asked. "No." And after a while, no one dared to ask. Your father was respected, and Patricia had a way of making questions disappear. Evelyn leaned closer. "I don't know what this all means, but if you want to find answers, start with your birth records. Georgia Vital Records Office. That's where people hide things they don't want found." I left Savannah that evening with the photograph tucked safely inside my jacket. The sun was setting behind the marshes, the sky bleeding gold and crimson. I kept replaying Evelyn's voice. "You look just like her." Back in Fayetteville, the apartment felt foreign again. I laid the photograph on the table under the lamp and studied it. The woman's smile was faint, but her eyes' steady calm looked too familiar to dismiss. I called Dr. Ortega first thing the next morning. She answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting. "Captain Hale." "I need another test," I said, "a full comparison. Not against the service record, against someone else." "Who, Elise Carson? A missing person from Georgia. I'll send you what I have." There was a silence long enough for me to hear the low hum of her computer. "Send it to me directly," she said. "No intermediaries. I'll run it quietly." 2 days later, she called back. I was sanding an old rocking chair in the workshop when the phone rang. "Captain Hale," she said, her voice careful, "we have a result. The DNA you submitted matches Elise Carson's file in the National Missing Persons Database. 99.9% probability. She is your biological mother." I felt the world tilt again, the steady hum of the sander fading into silence. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I'm afraid it's not," she said. "There's more." The record lists her child as missing 6 months old, taken from a local park in Savannah in 1987. The case was never solved. I sank onto the floor, the phone still pressed to my ear. The photograph on the table caught the light again, that silver bracelet shining, like proof carved from the past. Dr. Ortega hesitated before speaking. "Captain, I don't think this was a random error. Someone forged your birth certificate and altered your service record decades ago. You may want to contact law enforcement. I'll assist however I can." When the call ended, I sat there for a long time. The smell of sawdust filled the room, grounding me just enough to keep breathing. My hands trembled, but not from fear. Something colder, sharper. For 38 years, I had lived as Rowan Hale, daughter of a Colonel Soldier survivor. But now that name felt like a uniform that didn't fit. Underneath it, someone else waited, a child stolen, a truth buried. The first crack had opened, and I could already feel the structure of my life beginning to give way. I drove back to Augusta under a sky the color of pewter, the kind of dull gray that looks heavy enough to fall. The highway wound through pine forests and old farm fields, places I hadn't seen in years, but still remembered in fragments: an abandoned gas station, a rusted water tower, the faded billboard that once promised luxury homes by Hale Development. My father's empire frozen in time. The closer I got, the more the air changed, thickening with humidity and memory. The Hale estate sat at the edge of town behind a gate that creaked like an accusation. Patricia had left it shuttered after the will reading, too busy protecting her social standing to live among ghosts. The padlock was new, but the hinges weren't. I broke in easily. Inside, the air was stale with dust and perfume, the scent of Patricia's bourbon-laced candles still lingering. I moved through the rooms like a trespasser in my own history. The study looked almost exactly as it had the night she burned my tags. The scorch marks were gone, but the smell of smoke lingered faintly in the carpet fibers. I ran my fingers across the mantel, feeling the grit of ash that housekeeping had missed. I opened drawers, checked under the desk behind framed photos. Nothing. Then behind a cabinet panel, I found a small metal latch slightly out of alignment. I pressed it. A section of the panel clicked open to reveal a narrow compartment filled with envelopes. My breath caught. The first was addressed in my father's handwriting, neat, deliberate, the way he used to write on his mission notes. The date read June 1987. Inside was a letter folded crisp but yellowed with age. I unfolded it carefully. If you're reading this, Rowan, then I have failed to protect the truth it began. I made choices to save what I thought was family. But there are debts no man can pay by silence. His words blurred for a moment. I forced myself to keep reading. You were brought into this house under circumstances I could never explain to the world. Patricia said she knew a woman who could help us after Claire's miscarriage after the doctor said there would be no more children. She told me it was adoption. I wanted to believe her. I signed papers I shouldn't have signed. Later, I learned that woman was no social worker. She was a broker, and I was too deep to undo what had been done. I sat down hard on the floor. The letter trembled in my hands. Every line stripped away another layer of the man I thought I knew. My father wasn't just complicit. He had known and he had chosen silence. If you ever learn the truth, the letter continued, know that I loved you, even if you were never mine by blood. I tried to keep Patricia from burying more than one life in this house. She told me the past was erased, but the past never erases clean. At the bottom, his signature, a faint smudge of ink. Beneath the letter was a small key labeled Box, Study Vault. I looked around until I found the small floor safe under the rug. The key turned easily. Inside were photographs, legal forms, and another envelope labeled Elise Carson. I opened it. A hospital bracelet, tiny marked Baby Carson, 1987, female. Next to it, a Polaroid of a newborn with the same silver bracelet around her wrist. My bracelet. My breath hitched. I sat there surrounded by evidence of my own kidnapping, and for the first time in my life, I felt the full weight of both truths. The man who raised me had loved me, but he had also stolen me. A noise outside jolted me upright, tires on gravel. I slipped the letters into my bag and moved to the window. A car idled at the gate. Patricia's Lexus. She was alone. She stepped out wearing sunglasses and that same practiced calm, the kind that looked like control but smelled like fear. She looked thinner, brittle. I watched her walk toward the house, fumbling with the keys. I waited until she stepped inside, looking for something I said from the study doorway. She froze. Her hand tightened on her purse strap. Rowan. "What are you doing here, cleaning up the past?" I said. I held up the envelope labeled Elise Carson. Her face drained of color. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "From the man you married. He left more behind than you thought." She tried to steady her voice. "You don't understand. Your father, he was desperate. We both were. I wanted a child and he wanted peace. That woman, Elise, she agreed. It was all arranged. Arranged, I repeated the word, tasting like ash. You paid someone to take a child from her mother. She wasn't fit to raise you, Patricia snapped. The mask cracked and the venom poured through. She was nothing. You would have grown up poor, sick, forgotten. We gave you everything. You gave me a lie, I said, and you built a mansion on it. Her voice rose sharp and shaking. I saved you. You saved yourself, I said quietly, from being childless, from being ordinary. I stepped closer. But you couldn't save your reputation this time. The VA knows. They're coordinating with the FBI. Her mouth fell open. You told them. No, I said. They found it themselves. Turns out stolen identities are a federal matter. She staggered back a step, eyes wide. For the first time, I saw fear instead of arrogance. She dropped her keys, hands trembling. You don't know what they'll do to me, she whispered. Maybe you should have thought about that before lighting fires, I said. I walked past her toward the door. Stay away from me, Patricia. The next time you see me, it'll be in court. I didn't look back, but I heard her whisper something behind me, something like a prayer or a curse. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of rain again. I stood for a long time by my truck, the letters clutched in my hand, the truth burning hotter than any fire Patricia could start. By the time I reached Fayetteville again, the sky had turned a dull bronze, the kind that presses against the windshield and makes everything feel slower. I sent copies of the letters and photographs to Dr. Ortega through a secure VA upload. Within an hour, she called. Captain Hale. She said, her tone clipped but urgent. I've shared your files with our legal liaison. The Bureau has been looped in. We need to meet in person. The following morning, I drove to Washington, D.C., the seat of both order and bureaucracy. The VA's Forensic Verification Division occupied a glass building that looked too clean for what it handled. Dr. Ortega met me in the lobby, dark hair pulled back, eyes focused the kind of woman who carried authority quietly. She led me through a maze of corridors until we reached a small conference room. Two men were waiting, one older, with calm eyes behind glasses, the other younger, sharp suit jaw set. Captain Hale, the older man, said, standing to shake my hand. Arthur Reeves, Federal Counsel. This is Calvin Reese, Veterans Affairs legal investigator. Calvin nodded once, a soldier's greeting. We've reviewed your materials, Arthur said, sliding a folder across the table. This is one of the most complex identity forgeries we've seen tied to a veteran's record. The documents your father signed were falsified under an adoption pretense, but the chain of custody suggests abduction. The same broker's signature appears in a closed case from Savannah, 1987. The Carson case, Dr. Ortega added. Calvin leaned forward, his voice steady but edged. We'll be working jointly with the FBI. They're reviewing the financial transactions connected to Patricia Hale's accounts. There were large cash withdrawals from a Hale Development subsidiary around that time, money that vanished off the books. My throat tightened. You think she paid for me? Calvin didn't answer right away. We think she paid to erase you from someone else. The room went still. Dr. Ortega broke the silence. Captain, this will move fast once the Bureau confirms the documents. You'll be contacted for testimony. The VA will issue a formal correction to your record restoring your status under your biological name. I looked at her. And what name is that? Rowan Elise Carson, she said gently. Hearing it felt like touching a live wire, painful, clarifying. It was the first time anyone had said it aloud to me. You'll have the option to retain your current identification for service history, Calvin said. But the record will show both names linked under verified identity restoration. It's rare, but it's happened before. I nodded slowly, feeling the words settle. What happens to Patricia? That depends on what the Bureau uncovers, Calvin said, but forgery, obstruction, and fraud are certain. If the kidnapping angle holds, she'll face federal charges. He paused. She won't walk away from this. For a long time, none of us spoke. The hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. I studied the folder in front of me, official seals, signatures, acronyms that looked like pieces of my own life scattered across paper. For years, Patricia had rewritten my story, but now the government itself was rewriting hers. I'll cooperate, I said finally, however long this takes. Calvin's mouth tightened into something that almost resembled respect. We'll make sure it counts. That evening, I stayed in a modest hotel near DuPont Circle. I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed my father's letter, the smell of Patricia's perfume, the burn of those dog tags turning to ash. For 12 years, I'd fought wars overseas. Now I was fighting one at home against lies old enough to drink bourbon. I stared out the window at the Capitol dome glowing under clouds and thought of all the soldiers whose names had vanished in paperwork. Mine had nearly joined them. The next morning, Dr. Ortega called again. The bureau ran the comparison, she said. The adoption papers used your father's signature, but the notary seal was forged. The broker, her name was Lydia McCaskill, was arrested 20 years ago for falsifying infant transfers. She died in prison. So Patricia used a dead woman's records to hide a living child, I said. Yes. And she covered the trail by bribing a clerk in the Augusta County Records Office. That man's deceased, too. But his son recently turned over his father's old ledgers to investigators. Your name, both of them are there. A silence stretched between us. Then Ortega said quietly, Captain, I know this is difficult, but the Bureau wants a statement from you tomorrow. Calvin will be there. They'll open the case formally as a federal investigation into identity fraud and abduction. They're calling it Operation Restoration. The phrase made something in me tighten, a mix of irony and vindication. For years, restoration had been my craft, taking broken wood, restoring its strength, its beauty. Now I was restoring a life. I met Calvin again the next day in a federal office near Union Station. He carried himself like a man who had seen too many half-truths. You've done more homework than most victims, he said after I finished recounting everything. You were trained to follow evidence, weren't you? 12 years of logistics and intelligence briefs, I said. He smiled faintly. Good. You'll need that discipline. This won't just be about your story, it'll be about proving motive. Patricia will claim ignorance, maybe paint herself as a grieving widow who didn't know what her husband arranged. She knew, I said quietly. She's known since the day she burned my tags. Calvin's expression hardened. Then we'll make sure the court knows it too. When the interview ended, he handed me his card. Call me if she contacts you. People like Patricia don't surrender quietly. That night, as I drove back toward North Carolina, the weight in my chest shifted. Not lighter, but steadier. The truth had stopped being a mystery, it was now a weapon, and for once, it was mine to wield. I reached my apartment just before midnight. Rain began to fall again, soft and rhythmic against the windows. I stood at my desk looking at the photograph of Elise Carson, the woman who had been missing for 38 years, the woman who had once held me in that sunlit garden. For the first time, I whispered her name like a prayer and a promise. Elise, I said softly, they can't erase you anymore. When you've lived long enough in the military, you learn that every counterattack starts with patience. You wait, you study, and you strike where it hurts most, not with rage, but with precision. That principle became my anchor after the bureau meeting. Patricia had always fought dirty, but she'd never fought someone who understood how systems work. This wasn't about screaming or throwing punches. This was about turning every lie she told into evidence that would stand in a courtroom. I spent the next week documenting everything. Emails, property deeds, even the burnt corner of my old dog tag case photographed, time-stamped, stored in encrypted drives. Dr. Ortega coordinated directly with Calvin Reese, building the case file that would merge my personal nightmare into a federal timeline. Each day felt like preparing an operations report, only this time the battlefield was public opinion. By the second week, word had started to leak. Local news picked up a segment about identity theft within military records. They didn't name me, but the details were close enough. I watched the anchors on screen talk about the anonymous veteran and felt my stomach twist. I knew Patricia would see it too. She thrived on appearances. Every story that chipped at her image would drive her closer to panic, and panic makes people sloppy. On the third day, she called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her voice was brittle, stripped of its usual confidence. Rowan, what have you done? I told the truth, I said. You're destroying your father's memory. No, I replied. I'm finally honoring it. She went silent for a few seconds, then her tone sharpened. Do you think people will believe you? You're nothing without this family's name. That's the difference between us, I said quietly. I don't need the name. I built mine. She hung up. That was her first mistake reaching out when she should have hidden. Calvin called me an hour later. She contacted you. Yes. Good, he said. Keep every message. We'll use her words. That night, I drafted a statement not for the media, not yet, but for the record. I described the night she burned my tags, the humiliation, the betrayal, the way the flames reflected on her face like victory. When I finished, I realized my hands were steady. I wasn't writing as a victim anymore. I was writing as a witness. Dr. Ortega called the next morning. The Bureau's ready to move forward, she said. We've got warrants for the Hale estate and Patricia's accounts. They're tracing payments to that broker network. There's more a connection between the fake adoption papers and your father's business transactions. Looks like Patricia used corporate funds to launder the payment. Corporate embezzlement on top of kidnapping, I said. That's poetic. She almost smiled. It's also airtight. The next few days blurred into meetings and signatures. Calvin's team prepared affidavits while Ortega finalized the DNA testimony packet. I wasn't just a client anymore, I was a witness for the prosecution. Still, I knew a court of law wouldn't be enough. Patricia's power came from reputation from the social circles that had always protected her. If I wanted justice to echo, it had to reach the same audience she'd built her empire on. That's when I contacted Army Times. The journalist I spoke with, a retired sergeant named Lucas Trent, listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You realize this will blow wide open, right? No going back." "I'm not going back," I said. "Not ever." We spent hours verifying dates, cross-checking names, making sure every statement was bulletproof. The story wasn't revenge, it was truth structured like a report. Lucas promised to run it once the indictment became public. The night before the Bureau moved in, I sat by the window again, watching rain blur the streetlights. For the first time in months, I felt calm. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was expectant, like the moment before a mission launch. I whispered into the dark, "You taught me control." Patricia, you just never understood what it really means. The next morning, agents raided the Hale estate. The footage appeared on local news within hours, flashing lightsmen in suits carrying boxes of documents. Patricia stood in her driveway wrapped in a shawl, shouting that it was all a mistake. She looked small, almost fragile. But I knew better. Fragile wasn't the same as innocent. That night, Lucas texted me a preview of the headline, "From Stolen Valor to Stolen Life Veteran Uncovers Family Fraud." I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't about shame anymore. It was about exposure. The story went live at sunrise. I was in the kitchen making coffee when the notification pinged my phone. The Army Times article filled the screen. My photo in uniform, the headline, bold and merciless. Captain Rowan Hale exposes decades-long fraud by prominent Augusta widow. Below it, the subheading federal probe reveals falsified identity embezzlement and forged military records linked to Patricia Hale. Within an hour, it spread across veteran networks, morning talk shows, and social media pages filled with flags and folded hands. My inbox flooded with messages, some from strangers, some from soldiers I hadn't seen in years. "We've got your sixth captain. About time someone called this out. They can burn the tags, but not the truth." Those words were heavier than metals. They meant people believed me. Patricia's world began to collapse in real time. The Hale Foundation website went dark. Sponsors withdrew from her charity gala. The Augusta social pages that once praised her now turned vicious screenshots of her with my father side by side with the federal indictment that listed her name. It was public humiliation on a scale even I hadn't expected. I watched the local news segment that evening, her lawyer outside the courthouse, sweat glistening under the cameras, insisting she was a victim of her late husband's misguided actions. Behind him, Patricia stood stone-faced, her hands trembling. For the first time, she looked like what she was cornered. Calvin called that night. "She's trying to cut a deal," he said. "Partial confession, lesser sentence. The Bureau won't go for it. Not with the adoption broker evidence and the embezzlement files." "What about the court date?" I asked. 2 weeks. You'll testify. Dr. Ortega will back your DNA verification, and the media coverage makes this impossible to bury." "Good," I said. "Let the truth breathe." When we hung up, I sat on the porch with a notebook in my lap. The night was warm, the cicadas loud enough to drown my thoughts. I wasn't writing a statement this time. I was writing something else, a letter. To whom it may concern, it began. The woman you saw on the news is not a villain in the traditional sense. She's something quieter, the kind of person who believes control is love, who calls ownership family. But control and love are not the same thing. They never were. I didn't know if I'd ever send it. Maybe it wasn't meant for her. Maybe it was for me. The next morning, Lucas called. "Rowan, you're trending again. The interview request list is insane, CNN, CBS even." "Good morning, America." I smiled faintly. "Let them wait. I'll talk when the verdict comes." "Not before." He laughed. "That's discipline, Captain. It's called mission order," I said. 2 weeks later, I walked into the courthouse wearing my dress uniform. It wasn't vanity, it was reminder. The courtroom was packed, reporters, veterans, neighbors. Patricia sat at the defense table, eyes hollow. When the prosecutor asked me to describe the night she burned my tags, I kept my voice steady. She told me my service was ashes and lies. But the truth is, lies burn easier. The crowd didn't move, but I could feel their silence thick with disbelief and fury. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Patricia didn't look at me. She just stared at the table, lips pressed tight, as though she could hold her world together by sheer force. Afterward, outside the courthouse, cameras flashed like gunfire. A reporter shouted, "Captain Hale, do you have a statement?" I paused at the top of the courthouse steps. "Justice doesn't always roar," I said. "Sometimes it walks in quietly and takes back what was stolen." Then I turned and walked away. That night, I received one last text from an unknown number. No threats, no anger, just 6 words. "You were never meant to survive." I deleted it without hesitation. Patricia could keep her ghosts. Mine had already been laid to rest. The next morning, I visited my father's grave. The headstone read, "Colonel Edward Hale, soldier, husband, father." I brushed off the leaves and placed a small silver bracelet on the stone, the same one that had once circled my baby wrist. "You tried to protect me," I whispered. "But protection without truth is just another prison." As I turned to leave, sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the metal like a spark. For the first time, I didn't look back. By the time the trial began, the courthouse in Cumberland County had become a stage. Cameras lined the steps, veterans in pressed uniforms filled the gallery, and local reporters whispered like vultures waiting for movement. The nation had turned its attention to one widow and one veteran, but beneath the spectacle lay something older and rawer, a question about what honor means when family becomes the battlefield. I sat at the plaintiff's table beside Calvin Reese, my uniform pressed so tightly it could have been armor. Across the aisle, Patricia wore black again, as though mourning something she hadn't yet lost. Her lawyer shuffled papers nervously while Dr. Ortega waited in the witness row, her expression composed but alert. The judge entered, gavel striking once, and silence fell like a curtain. The prosecutor opened with precision. "This case is not about inheritance," she said. "It's about identity stolen, falsified, and sold. It's about a woman who believed she could rewrite another human being's life, and a daughter who refused to let her." Every word landed with the rhythm of truth, sharpened by outrage. Patricia sat motionless, her eyes unfocused, a faint tremor in her hands. When the prosecutor displayed the photograph of Elise Carson holding her infant, the courtroom inhaled as one. "This child," she said, pointing to the projection, "was reported missing in Savannah in 1987. That child is sitting in this courtroom today." All eyes turned to me. My throat tightened, but I didn't flinch. The judge nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging not just evidence, but resurrection. Dr. Ortega took the stand next. Her testimony was clear, scientific, unassailable. She explained DNA verification procedures, the chain of custody, the improbability of error. Captain Hale's DNA matches Elise Carson's record with a probability exceeding 99.9%, she said. Furthermore, the genetic profile originally filed under her military ID belongs to another individual likely inserted to conceal the falsification. When the defense attorney tried to challenge her, asking if it was possible the records had been corrupted by time, she simply replied, "The truth doesn't degrade that way." A ripple of murmurs followed. Then came the financial evidence. Calvin handled that part personally, walking the court through a decade of embezzled funds, altered ledgers, and wire transfers. Mrs. Hale used corporate accounts to funnel untraceable payments to a known adoption broker, he said. She hid the theft behind charitable donations. Every lie she told came with a receipt. Patricia's jaw clenched so tightly I could hear her teeth grind. When it was my turn to testify, the room grew impossibly still. I took the oath, placed my hand on the Bible, and looked straight ahead. The prosecutor began gently. "Captain Hale, in your own words, what happened the night your stepmother burned your dog tags?" My voice didn't shake. She called my service a lie. She told me I was unworthy of the name Hale. Then she threw my identification tags into the fire. "And how did that make you feel?" Like I'd spent 12 years serving a country that couldn't protect me from my own home, I said. But it also reminded me what service really means. You don't wear honor, you live it. The judge's pen paused. Even the defense attorney looked momentarily still. "Why bring this case now?" the prosecutor asked. "Because truth delayed is justice denied," I answered, and because silence was how she won for too long. The rest unfolded like a slow unraveling. The letters my father left were presented, each one a confession signed in ink too heavy to ignore. The jury read every word. When they reached the line, she told me the past was erased, but the past never erases clean. I saw one of the jurors wipe her eyes. The defense tried its best. Patricia's lawyer painted her as a grieving widow, manipulated by her late husband, arguing she had been emotionally fragile and misled by grief. It didn't work. The prosecutor's rebuttal was surgical. Mrs. Hale didn't grieve, she said. She profited. She didn't lose control. She exercised it. She took another woman's child, buried the evidence, and when that truth surfaced decades later, she burned the only symbol of that child's honor. That is not grief. That is domination. The words struck hard. Patricia flinched visibly for the first time. On the final day of testimony, the courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Veterans stood in the back wearing medals, their silence a verdict in itself. The air buzzed with tension, heat, and history. When the jury filed out, the judge ordered recess. I stepped into the hallway, my reflection catching in the glass door. For a moment, I saw two faces overlapping: Rowan Hale, the soldier, and Elise Carson's daughter, the stolen child. For the first time, they felt like one. When the jury returned, the foreperson, a middle-aged woman with silver hair, stood and read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Patricia Hale, guilty on all counts: fraud, obstruction, falsification of federal records, and accessory to abduction." The sound that followed wasn't applause, but something quieter, more powerful, the collective exhale of truth released. Patricia didn't look at me. She stared ahead, eyes glassy, as if the walls around her life had finally fallen inward. The judge's voice was firm, but not cruel. "Mrs. Hale, your actions corrupted both family and law. You've hidden behind reputation, but reputation cannot stand where honor has been destroyed. This court sentences you to 8 years in federal custody." As the bailiff approached, Patricia whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't want to. When she was led away, her steps faltered once on the marble floor, the sound echoing like the last note of a hymn. Outside, the crowd erupted. Reporters shouted questions, veterans saluted as I passed. Someone yelled. "Justice served, Captain," I nodded but said nothing. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. I gave my testimony not to win, but to restore what had been broken, the chain between truth and belonging. That night, as the courthouse lights dimmed and the news cycle replayed the verdict again and again, I sat alone in my truck watching the clip of Dr. Ortega's statement on TV. "This case reminds us that honor isn't inherited," she said. "It's proven." I turned off the screen. Outside, the flag above the courthouse rippled under the night wind, and for the first time since the fire, I believed it again. The courthouse was behind me, but its echo followed everywhere. For weeks, my name lingered in headlines. "Veteran Captain exposes decades of fraud." People stopped me in grocery stores and parking lots, even at the VA center, wanting to shake my hand to tell me I'd done the right thing. But heroism never feels like victory when it's born out of betrayal. After the trial, I drove to Augusta one last time. The Hale estate had been seized, its gates chained shut, the once immaculate gardens overgrown with weeds reclaiming the marble walkways. Inside, the rooms smelled of dust and silence. On the mantel still hung my father's portrait, his eyes fixed in that same calm expression he'd always worn when he told me to stand tall. I stood there for a long time before whispering, "It's done, Dad. She can't touch us anymore." Then I turned and walked out for the last time. The restitution funds and seized assets were returned to the Colonel Edward Hale Foundation, the charity my father had founded for wounded veterans. But I wanted to do more than just restore what Patricia had stolen. I wanted to transform the wreckage into something living. That's how Carson House began, named for Elise Carson, the woman I'd never known, but whose blood had endured every attempt to erase her. It would serve as a recovery center for female veterans, those who had survived both the battlefield and the quiet wars fought at home. I found an abandoned brick building near downtown Fayetteville, its windows shattered, its walls covered in ivy. Most people saw decay. I saw foundation. I cashed out the inheritance that had been legally restored to me, filed for nonprofit status, and spent months working with volunteers from the veteran community to rebuild it. Some nights I slept on a cot in the main hall, the sound of saws and drills echoing through the space. Every plank nailed into place felt like reclaiming something Patricia had burned. When the ribbon-cutting day came, I wore civilian clothes, jeans, boots, and the same dog tags I'd remade from the VA. The plaque by the door read Carson House, for women who served. The mayor gave a short speech. Dr. Ortega stood beside me, smiling quietly. Calvin Reese handed me a small box with the foundation's official certificate inside. But it was the small moments that mattered more, the veterans who walked in that first week, the sound of their laughter filling rooms that had once been hollow. One evening, about a month after the center opened, a young woman knocked on my office door. She couldn't have been more than 24, thin, pale, with tired eyes that looked far older than her face. "Ma'am," she said softly, "I almost gave up before I heard your story." She hesitated, then added, "They said you built this place from ashes." I smiled and nodded toward the chair across from me. "Sit down, soldier. Then you know you're in the right place." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "You gave me hope," she whispered. I reached out and placed my hand over hers. "Then my father's honor wasn't wasted," I said. The room went silent except for the soft ticking of the clock. That single exchange felt like the full measure of redemption. As the months passed, Carson House grew support groups, workshops, therapy sessions, and partnerships with local hospitals. Reporters came again this time not to talk about fraud or scandal, but about resilience. One headline read, "From Fire to Foundation, Captain Hale Rebuilds Honor, one veteran at a time." It made me laugh quietly. Honor doesn't rebuild, it remembers. It waits for us to come back to it. One afternoon, I received a letter from Evelyn Stroud, the neighbor who had first told me about Elise Carson. The handwriting trembled, but the words were clear. "You've given her justice, dear. She'd be proud. You took her silence and turned it into purpose. That's what legacy really is." I framed the letter and hung it in the hallway outside the office. It reminded everyone who passed through those doors that healing begins where truth is spoken. Even with the peace I'd built, there were nights when the memories returned, the firelight flickering against Patricia's cold smile, the sting of her slap, the sound of my own breath shaking. But they didn't own me anymore. They were just echoes, and echoes can't burn. I began speaking at veteran conferences talking about recovery justice and the invisible wounds that come from betrayal. Each time I stood at the podium and looked at the audience, I saw faces of men and women who'd carried their own versions of what I'd survived. When I spoke about how the system had failed to protect me, the applause wasn't loud, it was steady, like heartbeat rhythm, the kind that says, "We understand." One autumn morning, I returned to the old family graveyard in Augusta. My father's grave sat beside my mother's, his real wife, Margaret Hale, whose memory Patricia had nearly erased too. I placed a single white rose between their stones and said quietly, "You raised me to serve." I finally understand what that meant. As I stood, the wind carried the faint sound of the bass bugle from Fort Liberty in the distance. The note rose and fell like an answer. Later that evening, I walked through Carson House, just as the last sunlight spilled across the floors. The walls smelled faintly of paint and cedar. In the common room, a few women were gathered around a guitar, singing something soft and cracked with emotion. I stood at the doorway unseen, feeling that same quiet pride my father must have once felt watching me in uniform, the kind that doesn't need applause. When I turned off the lights that night, I looked back once more at the plaque above the entrance. For women who served. The reflection of the words glimmered faintly in the glass like an oath renewed. I whispered to the empty hallway. Some things were meant to be rebuilt. Outside, the sky was violet with the last trace of dusk. I breathed deeply, the air cool and full of wood smoke. For the first time since that night of the fire, I realized I wasn't walking away from the past anymore. I was walking toward the life that was meant to be mine. It took months before I could sit still in silence without feeling the echo of everything that had happened. There's a strange kind of quiet that follows justice too clean, too calm, as if life pauses to see whether you'll fill it with bitterness or peace. For the first time in years, I chose peace. I spent mornings walking along the Cape Fear River, watching the sunlight scatter across the current like fragments of something once broken but still beautiful. Every ripple reminded me of the firelight that had once consumed my past, now transformed into something softer. I carried no anger toward Patricia anymore. I had seen what her life looked like when stripped of control, empty, hollow, and brittle. Hatred would only chain me to her memory. Forgiveness wasn't approval, it was release. I began journaling again, something I hadn't done since the war. My handwriting had grown steadier, each page less about pain and more about understanding. One morning, I opened the last letter my father had written, the one the FBI had found sealed in his desk. It was dated 3 months before his death. Rowan, it began. I have kept a truth from you, not because I doubted your strength, but because I doubted the world's mercy. You were never a possession to me. You were a promise. Whatever blood runs in your veins, you were my daughter every day you stood for what was right. If someday this reaches you, let my silence teach you that love isn't about control. It's about protection. I couldn't save your mother, but I hoped I'd taught you how to save yourself. I read it twice before realizing tears were sliding down my face, not from grief, but from understanding. His silence hadn't been cowardice. It had been armor. He'd carried a secret so heavy it bent his spine, yet he never let it crush me. That night, I drove out to Fort Liberty, parking by the old memorial wall. The names shimmered under floodlights, rows upon rows of the fallen carved into black stone. I traced the letters of men and women I'd served beside. When I found my own name engraved among the supporters who had donated to rebuild the site, I smiled. For the first time, I was part of something that didn't vanish when the fire came. I whispered, "We made it, Dad." The air was cool, the night wind smelling faintly of pine and memory. A week later, Dr. Ortega visited Carson House for the first time since its opening. She walked the halls quietly, reading the quotes we'd painted on the walls. "Honor is what you do when no one's watching," and smiled. "You built something good here, Captain," she said. "Something that will last." I laughed softly. "Then maybe I can finally retire the rank." She tilted her head. "You earned it. Keep it." We sat outside afterward sipping coffee as dusk settled over Fayetteville. "Do you ever think about how small a decision it takes to change an entire life?" she asked. "Every day," I said. "A forged signature, a match in the wrong hand, a file left unchecked, and suddenly you're someone else." She nodded. "And yet you found your way back." I looked toward the horizon where the sky faded from gold to gray. "Maybe that's what service does to you. Teaches you how to come home even when the place you're coming back to doesn't exist anymore." Later that night, I met with Evelyn Stroud again. She was older now, her voice weaker, but her eyes were bright. We sat on her porch in Savannah, the cicadas humming softly in the background. "You know," she said, "Elise used to hum to you every night. Same tune you hear the crickets play now." I closed my eyes, listening. "She must have been patient," I said. "She was," Evelyn whispered, "and fierce, just like you." "You didn't inherit her pain, Rowan. You inherited her courage." We sat in silence for a long while. When I left, she pressed a small photograph into my hand, a faded image of a young nurse in uniform holding a baby with a silver bracelet. The same bracelet that now sat in a display case at Carson House. "Keep it," she said. "It's time it came home." Back in my office, I placed the photo beside my father's letter. Two halves of a truth that had taken a lifetime to find each other. The past no longer felt like a wound, it felt like soil rich enough to grow something new. As the year turned, Carson House expanded. We added a scholarship for women veterans pursuing degrees in social work and therapy. We held art therapy nights where survivors painted their memories layer over layer until color replaced pain. Every wall in that building told a story, but none louder than the quiet dignity of those who refused to give up. Sometimes in the early mornings, I'd stand in the courtyard watching the flag rise. I'd catch my reflection in the window, a woman with silver threading through her hair shoulders, still straight eyes, still steady. Not the soldier I used to be, but something freer. The kind of woman who no longer fought to prove her worth, only to protect her peace. On the anniversary of my father's death, I drove back to his grave and read his letter aloud. My voice didn't shake this time. "I get it now, Dad. You didn't hide the truth to keep me weak. You hid it to give me time to be strong enough to face it." When I looked up, the cemetery was quiet sunlight filtering through the trees in thin golden strands. I placed the photo of Elise beside the stone and smiled. "We're all home now," I said. As I walked away, I felt no need to turn back. Redemption had never been about undoing the past, it was about finally belonging to it. The invitation arrived in a plain white envelope stamped with the Department of Defense seal. Fort Liberty Veterans Memorial Ceremony. Guest speaker, Captain Rowan Hale. Rhett. I stared at it for a long time, unsure how I felt. The words, guest speaker, carried weight, but it wasn't pride, I felt it was reverence. I had once stood in uniform under the same flag saluting others as their names were etched in stone. Now I was being asked to speak not about combat or loss, but about survival, the kind that happens long after the war ends. The morning of the ceremony was clear and cool, the sky a crisp Carolina blue. The air smelled of pine and fresh-cut grass. Rows of folding chairs faced the black granite memorial wall polished to a mirror sheen. Cameras from national networks lined the perimeter, and clusters of veterans sat side by side, young and old, some in dress blues, others in faded jackets marked with years of service. When I stepped onto the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, I saw myself reflected in the granite behind them, no longer a soldier defined by someone else's lies, but a woman defined by truth. The announcer's voice carried through the speakers. "Please welcome Captain Rowan Hale, United States Army retired." The applause was gentle, but genuine, like a tide rolling in. I approached the podium, took a breath, and began. "When I first put on this uniform," I said, my voice steady, "I thought service meant sacrifice. I thought it meant carrying burdens so others wouldn't have to. I didn't know that one day the burden would be my own name." The audience listened without moving the flags behind them, rippling softly in the morning wind. They burned my dog tags once I continued. They tried to erase my service, my family, and my past. But here's the thing about truth: it doesn't burn. It waits. It endures. It outlives the lies built to bury it. I paused, scanning the faces in the crowd, men with silver hair, women with medals pinned over their hearts, younger soldiers still learning what honor costs. My father used to say, "Honor is what you do when no one's watching." For a long time, no one was watching me. And still, I chose to stand. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted to live in a world where integrity means something again. A few heads nodded. Others wiped their eyes quietly. "Patricia Hale tried to make me small," I said. But in doing so, she reminded me how wide truth can grow when you plant it in courage. Behind me, the granite wall gleamed. The engraved names caught the light, tiny sparks of memory and sacrifice. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver bracelet, the same one that had survived every storm. "This belonged to a woman I never met," I said softly. "My mother, Elise Carson. She never got to see who I became, but I like to think she'd understand why I had to walk through fire to find her." I placed the bracelet on the podium, letting it catch the sunlight. "Some wars end with treaties. Others end when you choose peace. Today, I choose peace." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of gratitude, grief, and understanding. Then one by one, people began to rise. A few saluted. Others simply stood in quiet respect. I nodded once, not as a gesture of command, but of communion. When the ceremony ended, reporters tried to catch me for interviews, but I walked past them toward the memorial. I touched the engraved names again, feeling the cool stone under my fingertips. A woman beside me whispered, "Your story gave me strength." I smiled faintly. It gave me mine too. As the cameras pulled back and the flag rippled above, I turned once more to the audience and said into the microphone, "They burned metal. They couldn't burn truth." The crowd broke into applause that echoed against the granite and sky. I closed the speech with the only words that felt right. Some people inherit money, others inherit silence. I inherited a war and I won it. If this story made you think about what family honor or justice mean to you, leave your thoughts below. Tell me where you were when you realized that truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way home. The final image on the broadcast was me walking away from the stage, the wind lifting the edge of my blazer, the sunlight catching the dog tags around my neck. I didn't look back. Some stories don't need to be retold. They just need to be lived right this time.